In the heart of a vast forest, where sunlight wove golden threads through the emerald canopy and the wind carried whispers of 1,000 unseen creatures, there lived a magnificent stag. Once he had been the pride of the woodland, tall, swift, and noble, with antlers that crowned his head like living branches of ivory. His stride was graceful and powerful, and his eyes glimmered with confidence. Every creature in the forest knew him as the Old Stag now, but in his youth he had been a legend. In those days, the young stag had led the herds. When danger came, he stood firm. When the hunters entered the woods, it was he who led his kind to safety through narrow paths and hidden streams. The forest had been his kingdom, and he had ruled not through force, but through wisdom and courage. Seasons passed. The leaves that once shone green turned to gold, then brown, then fell, and with each cycle the stag's step grew a little slower. His once glossy coat turned rougher, his antlers heavier, but his heart remained proud. He still stood tall on the ridge at dawn, gazing at the rising sun, as he had done every day of his life. One autumn morning, when the mist clung thick to the earth, the stag walked to a quiet brook to drink. The forest was silent, the air cool. He lowered his great head and saw his reflection ripple in the water. The face that stared back at him was older now, his muzzle flecked with grey, his eyes deeper, wiser, but weary. His once mighty neck had thinned, and scars marked his flanks from battles long past. For a long time he stared at that reflection. In it he saw the shadow of his younger self, the stag who had outrun wolves, who had fought rivals for dominance, who had danced in the rain while the thunder rolled above. He felt a strange ache in his heart, not from pain, but from memory. The forest had changed. The young stags now raced through the meadows where he once ruled. The deer he had once protected now grazed under the watch of others. Time, relentless and silent, had carried everything forward, everything except him. As he lifted his head, he heard a rustle from behind. A group of young stags had approached, their coats sleek, their antlers sharp. They paused when they saw him. For a moment there was silence, respect mixed with curiosity. One of the younger ones stepped forward. His antlers were smaller but newly polished, gleaming in the morning light. "Old one," the young stag said gently, "the herd is moving toward the lower meadow. Will you come with us?" The old stag studied him. There was kindness in the young one's eyes, but also pity, a look the old stag had seen before and never liked. "I will follow later," he said. His voice was calm, deep, and still carried the authority of years gone by. The young stag nodded and moved on, leading the others through the trees. The old stag watched them disappear, their silhouettes fading into the mist. He turned back to the water. His reflection trembled with the ripples, as if time itself were erasing him bit by bit. He felt the weight of his years pressing down. The forest had once sung his name, now it merely whispered. But the old stag was not one to surrender easily. Deep within, a spark of pride remained, a need to prove, perhaps to himself, that he was not yet done. That day he climbed higher into the forest hills, moving with careful but determined steps. His hooves struck the soft earth, leaving faint impressions behind. The woods grew denser, darker. The air was filled with the scent of moss and pine. As he moved through the shadows, he heard something that made his muscles tense, the distant cry of hounds. It came faintly at first, carried by the wind, then clearer, sharper. Hunters. The old stag's heart quickened. He had faced such sounds countless times before. His instincts flared to life, every nerve awake. Though his body had slowed, his mind was still sharp as ever. The barking grew nearer. He could hear the tramp of horses, the shouts of men. The old stag raised his head, nostrils flaring, sensing the direction of danger. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, without hesitation, he ran. His legs, though no longer young, carried him swiftly across the uneven ground. Branches whipped against his sides, and the undergrowth crackled beneath his hooves. Behind him, the hunter's cries grew louder. He knew these woods better than any creature alive. Every hollow, every stream, every fallen log, they were etched into his memory like the lines of an old song. He wove through them with the grace of experience, but time had taken its toll. His breath came harder, his stride shorter. At last he reached a familiar clearing, a place where sunlight spilled through an opening in the canopy. He paused for just a heartbeat, remembering how many times he had stood here, victorious and proud. The sound of the hounds snapped him back to reality. He turned toward the river. The river had always been his ally, deep, strong, with a swift current. He had crossed it many times to escape pursuit. But the rains had been scarce this year, and the water had grown shallow. He stepped into it, feeling the cold bite his legs. Midway through, he looked back. The hounds had broken through the trees, their eyes burning with hunger. Behind them, the hunters urged their horses forward, their horns blaring. The old stag drew a deep breath. His heart pounded fiercely, echoing the rhythm of his youth. For one last time, he summoned the strength of the forest within him. With a mighty bound, he cleared the far bank, landing heavily but upright. He stumbled, his legs trembling. The river splashed behind him as the hounds leaped in pursuit. He turned, antlers lowered, eyes blazing with defiance. The first hound lunged. The stag struck with his antlers, a flash of power and fury. The animal yelped and fell back. Another followed, and another, circling him, snapping. The old stag fought like the king he had once been, each blow deliberate, each step measured. But numbers told their tale. His strength began to fade. The hunter's shouts drew closer. The old stag knew his time had come. He turned once more toward the trees, toward the deep, ancient heart of the forest where he had been born. Sunlight filtered through the branches, golden and soft, like a final blessing. He took one step, then another, each slower than the last. Finally, he stopped beside an old oak, its roots coiled like the arms of the earth itself. He bowed his head, his breath shallow. The sounds of the chase grew faint now, muffled by the wind and distance. In his mind he saw the forest as it had once been, the laughter of running streams, the dance of young deer, the endless freedom of his youth. He saw the faces of those he had led, those who had followed him without question. He had lived well. He had run far. The forest seemed to hold him in silence. The old oak's leaves rustled softly, as if whispering farewell. When the hunters arrived minutes later, they found the hounds standing still, noses lowered. The old stag lay beside the oak, peaceful, his great antlers resting like a crown upon the forest floor. The men stopped in their tracks. None spoke, for even they could feel that they were in the presence of something greater than a mere animal. They stood before the end of an era. One of the hunters, a young man, stepped closer. He looked down at the stag, at the scars, the weathered coat, the nobility that lingered even in death. He was old. One of them said softly, "But look at him, what a creature." The young man knelt and touched the antlers with quiet reverence. "He's been in these woods longer than any of us," he murmured. "He deserved to die free." The others nodded. And for once, there was no triumph in their faces, only respect. They turned and left him there, under the oak, where the forest could reclaim him. Days passed. The wind carried the story through the trees. The deer whispered it in their herds, the birds in their nests, the foxes in their dens. The legend of the old stag grew, not for how he died, but for how he had lived, proud, wise, and unyielding to time. The forest mourned in its own way. The grasses grew softer where he had fallen, and wildflowers bloomed near the roots of the oak. When the rain came, it washed the earth clean, leaving behind only the memory of his strength. And so the old stag became part of the forest once more, his spirit carried in the rustling leaves, his courage in the hearts of all who roamed those woods. Years later, when the young stags of that time had grown old themselves, they would bring their fawns to that same oak. They would stand silently for a moment, as if listening. The wind, gentle and low, would move through the branches, and in that whisper they swore they could hear him still, the steady breath, the soft tread, the proud heart that had never known surrender. The old oak stood tall above his resting place, its branches spread wide like sheltering arms. Each dawn the light would fall upon it first, as if the sun itself bowed in remembrance. The story of the old stag became a lesson for generations, that strength is not measured by youth or power, but by dignity, courage, and the will to stand proud, even as time takes everything else away. There were days when travelers passing through the forest would stop and feel something, a presence, a calm, an unspoken wisdom. They would look up at the old oak, and for reasons they could not name, they would feel both humbled and comforted. For the old stag was not truly gone. His spirit lived in the forest, in the whisper of wind through leaves, in the stillness before dawn, in the quiet strength that endures long after the world has moved on. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of all, not the power of youth or the glory of victory, but the grace to face the end with pride, to live in harmony with the land, and to leave behind something that cannot die, the memory of a noble heart. Even now, on clear autumn mornings, when the mist drifts across the river and sunlight filters through the golden canopy, the deer sometimes lift their heads as if listening, and if you stand very still, you might hear it too, the faint echo of hooves in the distance, the rhythm of a heart that once beat for the wild freedom of the forest. The legend says that when the moon rises full and silver, a stag of light walks beneath the oak, his antlers shimmering like branches of stars. The forest grows silent, then, every creature pausing, paying homage, for they all know that the spirit of the old stag still watches over them, eternal, proud, and free.